Probably would have been in the early 80s when the Skeptics were started. In the late 70s and 80s, I was a trade press journalist and editor of publications for various industries. One was for the food and chemical industry, and another one was for the laboratory science people working in laboratories. The US Department of Commerce used to have regular exhibitions of American technology. They used to have them actually in their little offices in Milsons Point in Sydney, which was not particularly big, or occasionally also within larger exhibitions, larger trade exhibitions. So I'd go along to those exhibitions as a reporter, editor, looking at the technology. And there was this rather large gentleman who was actually the exhibition's organiser, or the exhibitionist as we used to call him, in more ways than one, and that was Barry Williams. So I got to know Barry before the Skeptics started. He was Barry Williams, as always, as everyone knows Barry Williams. He's sort of loud voice, dominating, funny. And therefore when the Skeptics started, he basically said, you should be on the committee. So he almost grabbed me and pulled me in. And because of an interest in science generally and that sort of stuff, and also an interest in skeptical topics, I was happy to join. So I think I joined from the very first meeting.
So he'd already started the committee or was on a committee when he approached you?
I'm trying to think of the actual date that I joined. I mean, sort of when the Skeptics were started in New South Wales, which was after James Randi and Dick Smith's water dividing tests, Barry put up his hand and said, if you're ever going to do anything more formal for this sort of area activity, count me in. And when the group in Melbourne started off, which was the formal sort of national headquarters, secretariat, whatever you like to call it, of Skeptics, they said, Barry, you're it for the New South Wales rep. I don't know how much vetting of people they actually did, not a lot, just anyone who put their hand up was obviously qualified. So Barry then started off committee meetings pretty soon after the Victorian one did, not immediately, but I think it was in the same year, and that was when I came on board.
Who else was on the committee? Do you remember those days? Where did you meet?
Vaguely. We used to meet in his offices in the US Department of Commerce, in their trade centre, which was in Milsons Point, same building as SBS. Actually, the special broadcasting service, and they used to annoy when we were sort of taking up an elevator to get up and down to our floors and stopping them from rushing into the studio, etc. So that was always an interesting experience. Yeah, in the boardroom of the US Department of Commerce there at the back, which was supposedly a secure building even then, back in the early 80s, and it was fairly secure except for the fridge. We used to help ourselves to the occasional beer at duty-free prices, which is always nice. Carefully put back the empty bottles, of course, in the fridge to pretend we'd never been there. But the other people were people like Mel Dixon, who's still around in the skeptical movement, John Smirk, who's still around in the skeptical movement, quite a few others. Jean Whittle, I think, was there in the first year. A lot of them came from the humanist movement and from the rationalist movement, and they moved across to the skeptical movement because it was more fun, basically. And our meetings were fun in those days, very casual, because we weren't the national committee, or we weren't the national secretariat. We didn't have the same obligations and burdens. But we still set ourselves up, and we had meetings, we had dinners and that sort of stuff, and we were definitely pushing ourselves to be media savvy. And that was one of the key things that me being a journalist and Barry being an exhibitionist worked very well. We actually made that a very, very strong point of what we were doing in New South Wales, even though we weren't the national committee. Other people who were media savvy was obviously Mark Plummer, who was a lawyer, who was head of the Skeptics in Victoria, who was a annoying dynamo. He would phone you up any time of the day or night, and tends to be the professional hazard of presidents of the Skeptics, who like to do that all the time. And honestly, he'd then hit you with a question or something, and you think, I'm still asleep, Mark. And I remember once having to answer media queries for a topic I knew nothing about because it had just come out in the magazine. I hadn't seen the magazine. But Mark would do that. Mark would throw himself in the deep end and throw us in the deep end. So even though we weren't National Secretariat, we were good product.
So you were handling media for Sydney, or Barry, or both of you?
Anybody. There was we didn't have many. We had a secretary. I wasn't it. I think at the early days, in the early days, I was just a fair standard committee member. I don't think I had any particular duties at that stage. I soon did, and fairly quickly into the piece, I became secretary, treasurer, and later on editor of the magazine. So that was quite an interesting load of things to do. In 1985, Mark Plummer, we decided to go one step further and have a major meeting, a major convention. And for some reason, we did it in New South Wales, even though we weren't the National Secretariat. So we set up a convention, a small bunch of us, and the location was about 100 metres up the road from where Barry used to work, in the Institution of Engineers building in North Sydney, Milsons Point, North Sydney. We promoted it as much as we could with our limited resources, and frankly, we weren't PR professionals. And we had a huge turnout. We had intentions to take everyone's name down as they came in, and they paid their money, and we just gave that up, taking names. We just had a huge turnout. We had about 3 or 4 TV crews there who were filming things that we had in the very first convention, like a demonstration of psychic surgery, probably the first public demonstration of psychic surgery in Australia. We had some. It was a magician, and he had 2 helpers. I forget the guy's name, but I can probably sort of dig that one up at one stage. But I mean, and he did that on stage with obviously TV crews gathered around. So unfortunately, a lot of the audience couldn't see everything. But that got a lot of publicity. And there was someone else, Don Laycock, who did a demonstration of speaking in tongues. So we had a lot of sort of very much practical demonstrations of things in the skeptical community. And this was the first time anything like this had been done in Australia. So it was a lot of, and it was classic skeptical topics, that we all loved and that sort of thing. So we're talking about UFOs. Chum Williams, who's a cosmetic surgeon, gave a talk about horrible homegrown surgery techniques of people having their noses removed and all sorts of sort of folk cures and things like that. So it was a very good event, very successful. A lot of people came along, a lot of people grew a lot of interest, people who were totally knew nothing about the skeptics but thought this would be a fascinating thing, and it was. So then the following year, Mark Plummer decided to step down as national president from the Victorian Skeptics. He actually got a job with PsyCop in the US as an executive officer up there. And so there weren't anybody to take on that role, especially the role of running most of the Skeptics' activities in Victoria. So basically, I think Barry and us put our hands up, or they were put up for us. And from 1985, the first convention, to 1986, we became the National Secretariat, as the description was, but it's also National Committee, really, except for the magazine. The magazine stayed in Victoria. I think James Durand, who was there were various editors. They'd had about 3 or 4 editors by that stage. But so then we started becoming the serious end of Skeptics management, and then we really pushed up. The only thing that the National Secretariat did as far as the other branches was say, yes, you can use the name. And in many cases, someone would just put their hand up and that was it. It was very, very casual. There was no sort of signing in or anything like that. Okay. And there was no control over what the individual groups did. I think after New South Wales, there was something in Queensland and Canberra, and then South Australia hopped on board pretty quickly, and WA and Tasmania. Northern Territory was always a bit slow to develop to that stage. But no, it wasn't a formal group in which one group had control over the others. So the term branches is sort of used pretty loosely, but really they were separate little groups, and they tried to coordinate activities, and we did, and they talked to each other well before the days of the internet and email and social media and everything.
So the whole idea of a national committee or whatever was more or less a way to coordinate.
Really, yeah. I mean, the National Committee was never a group from all the states, say. It was never a representative group. It was basically either hosted, placed, run by Victorians initially for about the first 5-6 years, and then New South Wales took on that role. They passed it over quite readily. There was an announcement made in the 1986 issue of the Skeptic Magazine when they said, because after the first convention, the success of that, they knew that New South Wales could handle organisation pretty well, and therefore they were happy. At least, the powers that be in Victoria were very happy to pass on the mantle.
So this is when the magazine landed in your lap? Huh?
Magazine landed in our lap the next year. Okay, well, after the water dividing tests of 1980, I'll pull this out. A magazine was launched pretty quickly. So the first issue came out in 1981, and if I'm careful with this, I'm sure you can get a shot of this later on, close up, etc. It was a 4-page tabloid, just like that, 1-page broadsheet folded in half. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the logo was the Skeptic, which is basically the same logo as the Skeptical Inquirer. They just photocopied and chopped off the Al Inquirer and stuck it on. So for many years, that was the logo, stolen off the American publication. This one, as you can see, has James Randi, Doris Stokes, psychic surgeons, and most of the back page is ads for the Skeptical Inquirer. So there wasn't a lot of new stuff in there. It was obviously professionally typeset, and that was done by Mark Plummer was the editor. James Durand was the word processor and general factotum of the Victorian Skeptics. So those two were sort of key in running it. After that first issue, they realised that a magazine of that sort was not really practical. So they then put out the first, this is the second issue of the magazine, came in an A4 size. Pretty casually put together, as you can see. Typeset, I think, on an IBM Selectric typewriter. Cut out on a bit of paper, stuck down to it's sheets, and then...
this is all still coming out of Melbourne?
This is all still coming out of Melbourne, yeah. This is the second issue, which came out in August 1981. And you can see that it had weird little drawings. No one knew who the fellow was who did the drawings. And it was fairly basic. And but, you know, it was a good little venture for an amateur group. First convention, New South Wales 85. National Secretariat moved up to New South Wales in 86. And the magazine came out by us in 1987, and that's the first issue. And there's a slight difference to the cut and paste versions that was done from Victoria. We actually had a little fundraising activity to try and get a computer to do desktop publishing.
And I see you're sporting the logo, which was in the competition, wasn't it?
That's right, yes. Yeah, that was done sort of pretty soon before then, actually. I think in about a year or so before, there was a campaign to develop a logo for the Skeptics, which was this one with the stripy lines and the question mark and things.
And that was used for some years, but then discontinued.
It was used for quite a while, yeah. It's probably into the 90s, I think. But this was desktop on a Macintosh. I think it was a Mac Plus or something like that, or Mac 2. I forget which one came first. We ended up having two different ones. A pain to use in those days. Very limited as to what you can lay out. The tendency to a little bomb to appear as a logo, and then the whole thing would crash. Right. And you've got to start again. All the issues of normal sort of typesetting, etc., were pretty much learn on the job. But we did this, so that went on for a while. I was the editor, and then in 1988 we had a breakthrough. We actually had a cover, which was not just the news stories, and we had coloured paper.
And that lasted for about 2 or 3 years, where you'd have a different colour for each season.
That's right.
I take it.
Yeah. Each issue actually, often as much as anything. But yeah.
One thing was green and
they were green, and there was a pinky and the blue
yellow,
one and that sort of thing. And this orangey colour. This artwork was me with bits of headline photocopies and stick it together and that sort of stuff. There's still a lot of sticking artwork down and that sort of thing. But I mean, the magazine was still sort of desktop publishing and like that. But it was fun. It was good, and it was slightly getting a bit more professional as you went on. And this particular issue was things like the Carlos hoax, Nullarbor UFO, and the police use of psychics, which are pretty good skeptical topics, and some of them are still very much valid today. So from then on, it was pretty much like that. In 1990, I had reached the stage where I was being secretary, treasurer and editor. I was and doing a job, as all of us were doing. We're all volunteers. I had to pull out. I'd had enough. So Barry happily took on the editorship. Barry, who was national president at the time, took on the editorship of the magazine for one issue, and that continued until 2008. So I think it was sort of 18 years later. That was his one issue, kept going for that length of time. And then he decided to retire, and eventually I returned to the fold.
Yes.
I was always committed, but I returned to the fold, the formal fold, as executive officer. And the magazine's gone on, and we sort of actually have professional designers now, so we have copiers, magazine covers like that, and it sort of looks more like a magazine, which you can see, and you can sort of throw some of that up if you want to on the screen, but it does look like a proper magazine now. So we were very proud of the Skeptic. We were very proud of our 38 years heritage, actually. We were the second oldest English language skeptical group in the world, after CSICOP, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, in the US, a title which they hated, but they had to use because the letterhead was already printed. I'm told by Ray Hyman told me that story. But before that, there were some European groups. There was a Dutch group that was set up actually in the mid-1800s, which was devoted to quackery, medicine areas. There was the British Psychic Research Association, again specifically on psychic areas, but it was aiming to be scientific investigation. There was a group set up in Belgium just after the Second World War, and CSICOP, which started up in the mid-70s, admitted that they based themselves on the Belgian group. They were inspired by the Belgian group and what it was all about. So then they started in the mid-70s, and with James Randi as one of the key people in there, and then Dick Smith found out about it and became I don't know if he was a fellow at that stage, but he was definitely a follower of the CSICOP, and that's when Dick brought James Randi out to Australia for the water divining tests, and that led to the creation of Australian Skeptics. Australian Skeptics has always taken itself very seriously, but not too seriously. As Paul Kurtz, who's the founder of CSICOP, said to us at the 2000 World Skeptics Congress, I think he said to Barry Williams, you guys have a lot of fun.
Were you at the 2000?
I missed that one, no.
Right.
That was when, I know you were there, he was sort of, which is surprising for Paul Kurtz, who was a pretty serious sort of man. But the thing he really liked about Australian Skeptics was we had fun. We had a strong sense of humour, and I think we've retained that, perhaps as part of the Australian psyche. And it is an attribute that we've always tried to maintain a lot. And again, it was one of Barry's sort of mantras was take everyone else seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. There were many things that we did in the early days. As I said, we were very concentrating on getting media coverage. We used to run a column in the magazine every time it came out with a list of the media we'd appeared in, and that would fill a column of the magazine, etc. And that would generally be Barry and me who were doing most of that, and a bit of Harry Edwards as well, who was at one stage secretary of the Skeptics.
There was a lot of creationism around it.
Creationism was probably the first big project that the Skeptics undertook. Two scientists from Queensland, Martin Bridgestock and Ken Smith, did a lot of research on creationist claims, and we published a book of their debunking of the claims along with a number of other authors who were involved in that. And that was an instant hit. It was sort of the first time that people had actually sat down and scientifically assessed creationist claims, who were supposedly scientists themselves. And we sold out 4 editions of that book within the first year. So that was enormously successful. And that was successful as a campaign too against creationism, because especially in Queensland, our far north is like the American Deep South, they were teaching creationism in science classes in some schools, public schools. And by our campaigns, especially by people like Martin Bridgestock up in Queensland, they were removed. They weren't allowed to teach creationism anymore in science classes, certainly. And in fact, most schools were not teaching creationism at all.
The Skeptics funded that book?
Yes. Yeah, the Skeptics paid for the book, and we charged for the book. But it was a huge success. Again, it was done by the people in Victoria who laid it out, etc., in the inimitable style of cut and paste and glue and sticking things down. But it was enormously successful. We published another book of exposing Uri Geller's tricks.
Gellerism, I think, by Ben Harris?
I think it might have been Ben Harris, yes. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I've got a copy of that somewhere. That caused a lot of fuss amongst magicians.
Yeah, I bet it did.
Who didn't like us exposing sort of tricks of the trade. And that's what was done.
Now, was that our book or his book, Ben Harris?
It was his book initially, but we published it, and we republished it, actually.
Do we have the rights to that?
I can actually look it up. I'll find out, actually. It was a long time ago. Yeah. And then we, especially the Canberra Skeptics, put out a book called Skeptical, which is like 1-page or 2-page rebuttals of a whole range of different topics.
Like a very condensed Skeptics dictionary.
Yeah. Of about 30, 40 50 topics, something like that, the standard skeptical, classic skeptical topics, and things you could hand out to people, which is still a good thing to have, actually, and of course the arguments haven't changed against a lot of those things. So in the first year we had a number of books published, we had the magazine coming, we had our conventions running, we had regular dinner meetings in most states. The concept of skeptics in the pub really hadn't taken off at that stage. There were more dinners. And a whole range of media activities. So we were very, very busy. And we would appear at anything at the drop of a hat.
Well, and shows like the Couchman Show.
Yeah, the Couchman. Yeah.
You were there, I know, in the audience for an episode they did on UFOs. Did you attend any other episodes of that?
I think there was one on psychics as well. I'm trying to remember, actually. Yes, it's a fair while ago. But I mean, we would appear, and we would be invited to appear at these programs that were having a psychic or someone on to give a demonstration. And in many cases it was annoying because you wouldn't get much coverage for a skeptical point of view, despite the intentions of doing so, or if we did speak, it was often minimised or cut down. So that was part of the frustration. But we were there. And I think our role then, as it is now, is we're not going to destroy or totally debunk all of these activities. Some of them come and go. The creationism was certainly sort of put back a long way. But our job is to put a cap on the claims that people make. And I think that's a very important role. Even if we don't stop them making claims, they tend to be a bit more cautious in the claims they make, because we will not let them get away with it. A classic one that we had was a channeler, when channeling was a big thing in the late 80s, a fellow named Cliff Dorian, who we call the dribbling psychic. He used to sit on stage and he'd channel, several thousand-year-old entity or tens of thousand-year-old entity. I forget the name of it, actually. But he'd dribble while he was doing it. That was part of his intensity, showing here. Trouble is he had a beard. And someone dribbles into their beard and you sort of, gets a bit messy. But he had followers from it was a lighthouse centre or something like that. I forget what the name of it was. And we used to go to his things all the time, actually. And he could speak to the dead, or through his channel entity, he could sort of speak to dead people. And I think he spoke to Harry Edwards' mother. Unfortunately, she wasn't dead, so that was a problem. And he was pretty mediocre. He then appeared on TV, on a daytime TV show with Barry, and he had his own challenge. He had a suitcase full of money, he said. It had money on top. I think it might have been the Mike Walsh show, yeah. And he said if the skeptics can prove he's not genuine, which is the age-old sort of argument, but Barry did actually challenge him to do something and he didn't do it very well, so Barry was going to grab the suitcase on the spot, but he quickly whisked it away. We suspect that he didn't quite have as much money as he said. I don't know if you want to include this, but we once actually got a letter from a solicitor named Ian Ord, who reckoned that Cliff Dorian had a rather juicy past up around Armidale. Trouble is, Cliff Dorian's not that clever, and it didn't take long to figure out that Ian Ord is an anagram of Dorian, and we figured that he was trying to set a trap for us.
Really?
Yeah. We didn't fall for the trap.
Wow.
But for a few moments there, it was tempting to start sort of trying to sort of
what a strange thing
to slander this fellow.
I see. And
we didn't. So that would have been disappointing for Cliff, I think, and he probably stopped dribbling for a few minutes there. We had a lot of those things, a lot of confrontation with things. Because we were new, in the early days, we were the sort of things that the media would not take that seriously. We'd be there for humour, for fun. The sort of thing you get after the weather on the TV news.
Sure.
And I don't know how many times I was asked, but do the skeptics believe in themselves? And I'd normally respond by saying, congratulations, you're the 1 millionth person to make that joke, which they don't like when you say it. And gradually, though, they realised that we actually had something worthwhile to say, and that the people we were criticising were people who needed to be criticised because they were ripping people off financially, emotionally, whatever, and that these things weren't quite as benign as the media, who were looking for their quick, cheap stories, were prone to portray them as. Okay, we have done various water divining tests over the years. I wasn't involved in the first Randy sort of Dick Smith one. That was done before the Skeptics started, but I was involved in several others. And so was Ian, actually. I remember sort of Ian, who you'll be recording at some stage as well. We were one in the late 80s where we had this complicated system up for drilling holes in the ground. There's a place out in the western Sydney somewhere in a field somewhere, of drilling holes in the ground with an auger. We chose a very good spot. It was rock hard. And I think we got as far as drilling one hole, and it was sort of nowhere near as deep as we were hoping to be. Putting stuff in the hole, we had about, I think, 6 or 8 in a row, in pairs. We had this system of walking underneath a covered frame of wood. We had to crawl, pretend to put something in a hole. We'd roll a dice that was attached to the inside of the frame, and there were 2 of us would crawl along the ground, had this little lids, lift up a lid, roll the dice, slap the lids. No one knew which particular hole we were putting.
Was
gold
this the
nugget
one
or
that was recorded for a current affair assistant?
I think it was, yeah, there was a current affair was there, yeah.
Right, so there was a carpet.
There was a carpet first of all, yeah, and there was also these holes and things. And
yes, luckily we have the video record of that too.
I think my only role in that was to see my bum sticking out from behind this wooden frame, crawling across. It was very undignified. I blame Ian for that. Actually, it was his idea, the way he set it up and everything. After a while, it was taking a long time, so we just sort of basically said to the, especially Dick, saying to the diviners, turn around, look the other way, and we'll just stick it in one of these holes, and you've got to come back and find it. And then things like that were sort of, so some of them started off with the best of intentions, and then we made do. But it worked very well. And we had several times we had large bunches of diviners come along, and none of them performed better than chance, and they were very disappointed in that because they knew they had the skills.
So you were involved when the Carlos thing was happening?
Yes, yeah.
And you knew nothing about that, I take it? Like
There's a very small group of people who knew about the Carlos hoax, which was in the 1988, about that, 1987, 88, when Richard Carlton, who was a skeptic and was one of the reporters on 60 Minutes, the Australian 60 Minutes, knew Randy well and brought out Randy to manage this particular hoax, which was bringing out a psychic who was actually a friend of Randy's, and who appeared on a lot of TV shows, and we appeared on TV shows debunking this guy, not knowing that he was actually a fake. Yeah. And we did pretty well at exposing a lot of the tricks he was using without knowing that, just knowing that we look at his performances and says, you're a fake. Obviously he's a fake, but I mean...
Of, Harry Edwards on one show.
Harry Edwards was one show showing the trick where you put a ball under your arm and your armpit, which will stop your pulse. Yeah. Or apparently stop your pulse. That was one of the demonstrations, and it was exactly what Carlos was doing to indicate sort of stopping his pulse. Remember, there was a big meeting on at the Opera House. It was free.
Did you go to that?
I did, yes I did. And I got interviewed on TV at the end of that, talking about how we could see through his tricks, etc. We wanted to ask questions, but they weren't allowing questions. But there was a lot of people there. They filled the theatre, and it was paid for by Channel 9. Filled the theatre, and most 95% of the people there were believers, and they were convinced that he was genuine. He just sat on the stage. I think he might have sat on some cushions or something like that, and expounded on the wisdom of the ancients and channeling some particular entity. I forget which one it was. That was a big thing at the time. And then there were two. I remember there were 2 committee members on there who were practitioners of Auslan, the sign language.
Oh, sign language.
Yeah, the Australian sign language system. They used to teach it, so they were on opposite sides of the hall, signalling to each other with their own observations all the way through. Actually, that was pretty cool. That was sort of good. So we had various people on the committee who had various skills. But yeah, we were involved in that, and I was told about 3 hours before the program went to air that it was a hoax. Told by Barry Williams, and I think he'd learned about a day before. Yeah. So, and then we went out to Harry Edwards' place actually, and to meet Randy and Carlos and that sort of thing after the event. Of course, the big fuss. Primarily, the media were upset that they had been fooled. They take themselves very seriously. They couldn't see the joke, certainly. And they were more upset with being fooled than the idea of a fake psychic coming out or a channeler coming out and ripping people off left, right and centre. Well, not ripping people off in that case because they didn't charge, but others would. And so rather than exposing a fake, they said, well, you've made us look like fools. I said, well, actually, that wasn't very difficult. And we think that you actually went a long way to doing that yourselves because their investigation of this guy was pathetic. None. Apart from the fact, actually, of inviting a few skeptics on TV and radio to comment. And that, us being the national committee, we were the ones who were invited on TV and everything. So it was a lot of fun, a lot of controversy. It was one of several sort of hoaxes that were done in the 80s. One of them, another one was the Project Turbo, which was made up. Turbo being a fish, and therefore they were trying to hook the media and the public. They brought out Rob Steiner, who was a skeptic from San Francisco, I think, and a magician, to come out and pretend to be a psychic. And he appeared on several TV shows. He was the few people in the media who knew he was at what was happening. One of them was Bert Newton, and one of them was Darren Hinch, both of whom had TV shows and or radio and or print publicity, high profile. So they knew. And this fellow went across and did performances in Melbourne, around Melbourne, huge sellout crowds, huge numbers of people turning up, and then convincing people that he was a psychic very easily. He convinced the Australian Psychic Research Group. The president of that wrote an endorsement of him. It was, and what it made you realise was it's bloody easy. If you wanted to make a living out of fooling people, which obviously some people do, we could do it very easily. Then it was announced one evening on the Bert Newton show on TV, which Mark Plummer was on. This was during Mark Plummer's days. Mark Plummer was on, and Darren Hinch and Bert Newton were on there, and Steiner, revealing it. And after that, we had meetings in Sydney, which were initially promoted as Bob Steiner Psychic, but then had to be promoted as Bob Steiner Fake Psychic, and the numbers attending were a lot smaller. So people came along to a fake and they would not be at all interested in seeing someone who could expose a fake or expose fakery. So that was a very salutary experience, actually, for us, that if you're going to pull a hoax, keep it going until the very end. Don't finish it halfway through. And then the psychic research president wrote a piece saying he was never fooled. It was the ability of people to backtrack on things they say within a short period of time has been shown to us by diviners all the time, who within a few hours of failing will then find some excuse for why the test wasn't fair, which we've seen every time we do tests, and the same for anybody we do tests of. They will find an excuse very quickly. That's why it's important to record these things and to sort of present the fact that they did fail their tests. And this thing with Steiner, when people were made to look like fools and then objected to it. I think it's an old line in Huckleberry Finn, was someone saying the worst thing you can do is to expose a fool. And people don't like it at all. So in many times when we've done particular things in the Skeptics of this nature, the opprobrium has fallen on us rather than the people that we have exposed. And I see that all the time. I did an interview just the other day with someone saying that, but the skeptics are closed-minded. Old story. I don't know how many times you hear that. And of course the response is, well, how many people who are believers are open-minded?
Yeah.
Right? In fact, quite the opposite. I think skeptics are more open-minded. They vary, of course, from person to person, but generally more open-minded than the believers, who will believe any old thing. Just look at the photos of ghosts, most of which are about as unimpressive as you can imagine, and yet they become instant proof of the afterlife. So when people say the skeptics are close-minded, you really only have to look on the other side of the coin to see classic cases of that. So that's something we've tried to push all the way through the skeptics. The history is that we are about investigation. We are about unbiased investigation, as much as we can be unbiased. We obviously go into these things with a lot of history, and after 100 or 99 tests of something which have never worked out, the 100th you start to suspect that perhaps it's not going to work, but you never know, it might be the one. So therefore we keep doing it, and bashing our heads against the wall sometimes, but we've had some pretty good victories too.